everyone who is participating in the webinar today. I am Virgil Harris. I am a senior over at Smoky Hill, and my pronouns are he, him. And I am one of the Youth Celebrate Diversity board members. And what YCD, or Youth Celebrate Diversity, is we are a nonprofit dedicated to educating and empowering the youth to advance inclusion and equity for all. We believe that education is a vital human right and a tool that every young person gets to use to change the outcome of their society. And through this, we can create a more equitable society that values every person, every single one of them. And hopefully that through YCD, we can empower more youth to lead us to a more equitable, to a more understanding society. So, sorry. If you would like to introduce yourselves with your name, your pronouns, and what your connection to books is, what your profession is, if you will.
So my name is Brookie Parks. My pronouns are she, her. I'm currently a reference and instruction librarian at the University of Denver. However, my career started in public libraries. I have over 5 years of experience working between the Denver Public Library as well as the High Plains Library District in Weld County. I began my career working with children and families, and then when I switched to High Plains Library District, I was a teen services librarian. So that's how book bans are extremely relevant to my career at this point.
Hi, everyone. My name is Iris Hopper, and my pronouns are she, hers. I am a civil rights attorney who worked on a case that you will probably talk a little bit more about during this, Brookie's case here at the High Plains Library District in Colorado. Also represent a number of other librarians and educators who have been kind of caught up in some of the changes to curriculum and book bans and some of the hostility we've had towards embracing diversity of voices and experiences that we've kind of seen escalating in the last few years. And so that's been some of the legal work that I've been doing with respect to kind of First Amendment and censorship and discrimination. So that's a little bit about my background.
Hi, I'm Becky Russell, and I was a teacher librarian for 24 years, or teacher librarian. So I've been an educator, classroom teacher, and teacher librarian. Following that, I was the K-12 school library consultant for the state of Colorado. So basically, I was a librarian for Colorado school librarians and library parapros. And in the last 2 years since I left that position, I continue to instruct school librarian courses for the University of Colorado Denver online. And also I work on call. Brookie, I didn't know you were at Denver Public too, but I do some now. Recently got hired at Denver Public Library to do some on-call work with them and work with the public. So I have a strong passion for all of this as well and background.
Hi, everyone. I'm Miranda Dorn-Myers. I'm a government documents librarian at the State Library of Colorado. I also served as the co-chair of the Colorado Association of Libraries Intellectual Freedom Committee for about 4 years. I'm still a member of the committee, but not co-chairing anymore. So through that role, I got an opportunity to do a lot of training around intellectual freedom topics, especially book bans and censorship, and worked with a lot of people who were going through those issues in their own schools and libraries. So yeah, that's how I got involved in this work.
And I've been doing that too until this past year. So with Miranda's, Cal IFC co-chairs. Awesome.
Yes, we use a lot of acronyms. So if you hear Becky or I say Cal IFC, we're talking about the Intellectual Freedom Committee.
Yeah.
Wonderful. That's it's really great to hear that you all have such a deep-rooted background in this topic. So that was actually my first question was what was your background regarding banned books? And if you would like to elaborate on that, go ahead.
I think for me, the Cal IFC has been where I've gotten the most. As a teacher librarian, back when I was, seldom did we get bans to the degree that we're getting today.
Yeah, so I guess that leads me to my next question, and so what is the criteria that a book has to meet for a question to be banned, and what does that process look like? Do teachers get blamed for having those books in their classrooms? How often do they get in trouble for having those books in their classrooms or libraries?
I can start. In Colorado, it varies. It really is different district to district, but in schools and public libraries and other libraries as well, the biggest thing that helps protect against a book just being randomly pulled off the shelf is to ensure that one has what's called a reconsideration policy. It's part of when you're selecting books for the library as a librarian, when you're selecting books, you follow a set of guidelines called the selection policy. And then if for some reason someone finds a book objectionable, they should, if your library or library district has a policy in place called a reconsideration policy, there is a process before a book is removed that one follows, and it's usually part of school districts' policies and law that you adhere to that. Now, whether all schools follow that, that's not always the case, but that's sort of the criteria, Virgil, for how we, in the school world anyhow, and public library world, I think, how we try to ensure that books are protected and that there is a process followed when they aren't found, if they're protested.
Becky, that was
Interesting.
that was a really good explanation, I think, of the process. I wanted to add on to the end, maybe to just provide some insight on what happens when the process isn't followed, which I think is what's happening a lot now. So when we follow the reconsideration process, it's usually a pretty good discussion between whoever is challenging the book and the library staff or the school and the students, the teachers, whoever is involved. So typically that ends with a bigger understanding of why the book is in the library and it tends to stay on the shelves. So what happens when schools or libraries don't follow that process? That's when there's kind of a knee-jerk reaction. So we've seen a lot of people showing up to board meetings and kind of yelling or getting really heated. And I think that scares a lot of people. And so the knee-jerk reaction is just, well, let's pull the book off the shelf and just kind of get this over with. So that can also happen. You mentioned teachers having their own classroom libraries. Classroom libraries, I'm not sure how it works in every single school, but in my experience, those aren't subject to the reconsideration policies that Becky was talking about. So it can be a lot easier to ask a teacher to remove a book from their library, their in-classroom library, and say, maybe not outright, but have an implication of like, this might affect your job in the future if you don't take this book out of the classroom. So that's why we like to have these policies in place, so that because when they're followed, they typically work really well.
Yeah, and I think I'll kind of expand on that, as Miranda mentioned, that, it can create a situation where your job is in jeopardy. And that was exactly my experience. As a teen services librarian at the High Plains Library District, I was told to cancel my anti-racism workshop for teens, to cancel my LGBTQ program, and to rename my Read Woke book club because my programs were polarizing. And when I expressed my concerns about the censorship and I spoke out to my community, I was fired within 4 weeks. So I did lose my job.
I want to take a little bit of a step back too, because this is a huge and great question that you asked, Smokey. So one of them was, what are the criteria, right, for a book to be banned? So I want to take a step back and talk about, there's a difference between challenges and when a book is actually pulled from the shelves, whether it's in a library district or in a school system, right? And I think there's larger questions around kind of curriculum that I think you're kind of right to identify what happens in school when there's censorship, et cetera. But just in terms of what we've been seeing across the country is that there's certain books, types of books that are being challenged now in the last few years that involve kind of LGBTQ authors and experiences, authors of color talking about racism, that are being challenged disproportionately by some of the kind of community, kind of minority community members that are not in the majority at all, that I believe Miranda kind of mentioned. Challenging doesn't mean that those books should be pulled. There's a strategy right now by some organizations to try to target these books across the country. That challenges should not mean that the book is automatically pulled. But what everyone here is saying is talking about making sure that library systems and school systems have strong processes so that politics can't infect the pulling of books that are otherwise valuable. So there's kind of a lot of steps in the process, which is what I think that Becky and Miranda were talking about, that if there's a solid process in place, politics should not be swaying what books are pulled because they're valuable to the community and to individuals who need them. And so there has to be strong safeguards in place to make sure that just because a book is challenged doesn't mean by one person in the whole entire community or 5 people in the whole entire community doesn't mean that the rest of the community is robbed from being able to access that information or that type of programming. So in Brookie's case, they wanted her to cancel programming around this type of information and these types of themes and topics at a public library after there was kind of a political change, which all of you have probably been following a little bit, but we can talk about. So it's really important to have strong structures in place that don't just change based on the moment and make sure that valuable literature is available to everybody, regardless of if some people are challenging it.
And to go off of that, how does you mentioned that banning certain books and the process of getting these book bans does hurt marginalized minority groups. What groups specifically are being affected? I know that a lot of LGBTQ books are being banned, but specifically here in Colorado, because I've seen a lot of push against certain book series like Magical Boy, about a young trans man figuring out his magical powers through just his own process, and I've seen a lot of backlash for that one. What just are there like specific like criteria? Why are people very upset with certain books?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think there's not necessarily a certain criteria that people are looking for. It has mostly to do with the, I think, experience that's being reflected in all of the books that are being challenged right now. So I think there's a lot of different waves of censorship that have happened in this country, and they're typically really reactionary. So they happen at times when there's like a big societal or political change happening. So I think that this current wave of censorship that we're seeing this kind of seems to be motivated by the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement and rising awareness just in general of like systemic racism and homophobia and all these other types of discrimination that are sort of like woven into our society. And I think people feel really, really afraid that what they think, their values aren't going to be passed down to the next generation, or that like this power structure that benefits typically white, heterosexual, cisgendered men is kind of falling. And so people are really scared and like want to hang on to that power really hard. So I think that's kind of what's happening right now, and why we're seeing books, especially by Black and Brown authors and by LGBTQIA authors, their voices don't reflect this like majority that's typically held on the power. And so people who are in power right now feel really threatened by just people sharing their experiences.
Nothing to add. Well said for me.
I mean, I think, to build off a little bit about what Miranda said, I think there's fear. I also think there's very specific political exploitation that's happening right now that we've seen throughout our history. So if you look at desegregation, education, libraries, schools were always at the forefront of the spaces that people contested the most when there was a challenge to the historical hierarchies. And so you can read about kind of, Brown versus Board of Education, et cetera, but there was a lot of resistance to desegregating libraries, other public institutions where knowledge and information are, disseminated, right? And so I would place that in history here. And if we look at some of the strategies and tactics that were used to fight desegregation, I think you'll see them now as well. A lot of the language that is being used now around, parental rights or school choice or school standards was the exact same thing that segregationists were using to argue that desegregation should not occur in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, etc. And I think it's kind of a veiled it's a veiled rhetoric that Miranda was referencing, but also has real political gains for people. It's not just fear. There are people who are making careers out of this and galvanizing and gathering a lot of power by picking on minorities that really are just numerically outnumbered. There's just very little way to fight back at the ballot box, considering, gerrymandering, et cetera. And the history of disenfranchisement of these groups. And so they're very easy targets, political targets and scapegoats in a situation where people are looking to assume larger political power and social capital. So I think that is another reason that you're seeing certain books being targeted over the last few years, certain voices, histories, and information being targeted. And we've seen a recent rise in that.
Yeah, there's definitely been a recent rise. It's been a big topic at my school, and the librarians are actually encouraging us to read the books that other districts have deemed to be banned, if you will. So we keep bringing up this idea of experiences and how this isn't just a new idea, that this can be linked to ideas like desegregation and other movements similar, like the Black Lives Matter movement. In your experience, how is this affecting, from what you've seen, how are these books the books that are being banned currently affecting the communities around you? How is it are the students even aware of what's going on? Are the teachers upset? Can the teachers do anything?
I think it varies from district to district and school to school. I know Miranda and I did a session last month up in Fort Collins, and I think those teachers, some of them are aware, and there are some who probably aren't. It depends on what district you're in. At least in Colorado, it's not statewide here, like it is in certain states around the country where bans are just accepted. So from my experience, it just really, it depends. It is, I think some students are aware, some younger learners are aware, and some are not. And the more and that's why it's awesome, Virgil, that you're doing this, because the more that you and younger learners can let others know, I think that you're powerful advocates for librarians and teachers.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, because as a librarian, it's very difficult as just one person to stand up to an entire library district or numerous library districts or even just library organizations and try to address the issue without community support. So having teens become more aware of the issue and make their voices heard is going to be extremely important. You know, librarians can try to stand up for this and fight this all day long, and we're just one person. I can go to a board meeting for the public library and express my concern, and I get fired. Whereas if I have community support coming behind me and everybody else speaking and making their voices heard, that's what they pay attention to.
Yeah, I just want to build off of what Brookie just said in terms of community support. So a lot of the book bans, whether they're local book bans or you may be hearing about some states that are trying to ban certain content or books both in school curriculums and access to books in libraries. They are targeting librarian administrators and librarians. They're not targeting you because you have the right as students like you, Smokey, and young people to ask for information. That's your First Amendment right. You're allowed to go to a library and say, hey, I'm interested in this topic. Do you have any books on it? And they can't do anything about that. And you're allowed to say, I think these books should be available. And they can't do anything about that. What they can do is threaten librarians and administrators with loss of their jobs or with litigation if the books happen to be available. And so what a lot of the bills that are happening across the country is they're saying, hey, you should be able to sue librarians if you're anyone in the community who doesn't like that a book is available for other students or other youth to read, right? Not even just you can stop your own child from reading it because you have that right as a parent, but if you're just upset that there's a book in the library, you can file lawsuits against the librarians for not removing them, or the library system can lose its funding, right, from the state if they have any books or content or programming or anything in their curriculum that the state doesn't like. But they cannot really penalize students. They cannot penalize youth in the same way. And so I think community support, especially from all of youth, who is, I think, just far more adept at these conversations than earlier generations have been, right? And you guys grew up in a different time where these ideas are not as threatening to you, right? That community support is going to be imperative, whether it's talking to, administrators at your school or reading these books and making it known you're reading them and discussing them, making them available for other people, supporting librarians, going to town meetings. There's legislation that's being passed, for example, in Colorado that's trying to protect librarians. Should be coming up in the next few weeks. So calling in and testifying or coming to testify in support of those, because it's really all of the people who want to censor books are targeting, librarians. They don't really have the same power over you.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Oh, sorry, Virgil.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Thank you. That is a great point. Student voices are really, really powerful in these conversations because it is your information, it's your education, right? So doing those things like going to city or to your school board meetings, library board meetings, and sending in testimony to the State House for this legislation that's coming up is really, really powerful. But I know that it can be really scary to do that. Like I get nervous when I've done this in the past. So I want to recommend a resource. It's a website called Book Riot. And it's a blog for librarians, but they have a section of resources that are basically scripts for students to use when you're going to write a letter to your legislator or you're going to go up and talk in front of your school board meetings. So you can have something at least to help you be very confident that you're saying the right thing while you're there. Because I know it can be a really nerve-wracking thing to do.
Didn't know that, Miranda. Cool. I mean, I know to book right, but I've not seen that. That's awesome to learn.
Yeah, they have a lot of very, very helpful scripts. I've used them in the past. And they also have a really
Cool.
nice checklist for how teens can help combat book bans in their schools. So
Cool.
keep an eye out for that. I can share those resources too after this if you all are interested.
Yeah.
Those are really good. I'm glad that there are resources that are benefiting teenagers like me who don't want to see books banned. I guess do you think that there would be a better way to handle, instead of banning books, is there a better way we could instead, like, from what I remember, we had to have a paper signed in elementary school to read young adult books. Do you think there could be instead of just not letting us read a young adult books, they had us ask parent permission? Is there a better way instead of just straight up banning books and being like, oh, even though we penalize the librarians and not let the students get this information, is there a better way for both librarians and people who don't like the books and the students who want to read those books? Is there a better way, instead of banning, that we can tackle this issue?
I think in most libraries, and I think in most in school libraries too, a parent does have a right to say that they don't want their child individually to read a certain book, right? So that's always an option. And I think that's a good way. If you really don't want your child reading a certain book, you can do that instead of removing it for everybody in the library district or school district. So that's always an option. Having your parent sign permission slips is a good option too. My only concern with that would be that, sometimes parent or kids can't ask their parents for permission to find information about a topic that they're looking up. So if there's somebody who is trying to explore their sexuality and they know that their parents aren't going to be happy about that, then they might not want to go home and ask them to sign a permission slip to release a book. So I think having that information freely available is still really important.
My dogs
you could
agree with your
barely-
statement.
Thank you.
Could barely hear.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Virgil, I'm so sorry. I've been calling you Smokey because I was talking to Smokey all day today, but I feel really bad about that. I did want to add onto a little bit about what Miranda is saying, which is, for all intents and purposes, books are already vetted in the libraries to make sure they're age appropriate, right? So this concept of youth being able to just access extremely adult literature and check it out at a library without telling their parents, as far as I'm aware, is minimal. I mean, it's put in different sections. If a parent, and correct me if I'm wrong, like if a parent doesn't want them checking out an adult book from a library, they can there's already a process for that, right? But I don't know if we want to question whether youth literature that's already been vetted for that age group should be limited, because it already is kind of made to be age appropriate, though there are different subjective opinions of that with parents, right? And minors have a lot of First Amendment rights, which I think is really important to think about. What are children's First Amendment rights? Because they have them. They don't just gain First Amendment rights when they're 18, right? So what are their rights? And I think it's a very complex question. What are their rights vis-a-vis their parents? vis-a-vis public institutions, right? And so I think it is important to think about kind of what your rights are. What are your rights to access information, as well as what your parents' rights are, and as well as what the community's rights are, which is what I think Miranda was saying. You know, there already are many processes in place sometimes for, and they can tell you more about those, for when a youth wants to check out, you know, a book that may have adult content in it, right? Or adult themes, or arguably adult content and themes. I'm not sure everything that's being characterized today really is adult content or themes. And it just sounds more like discrimination. But you know, why would that impact everyone else's rights in the community to access that book? And that's the problem with book bans, right? It's stifling everyone else's rights in the name of the chance that, you know, your child who you don't want accessing a book might walk into a library and, you know, potentially read it in the library. And I think that's an argument that for years didn't go anywhere because it really doesn't happen all that often, and is being used kind of as a smokescreen for First Amendment suppression, censorship, and discrimination.
You know what, actually, to kind of touch on some of what you said there too, Eris, an argument that I've heard a lot of the times is that, you know, parents are so concerned with what their children are reading that they want to implement these book bans, but they have a cell phone that they can literally access any kind of information to. And we don't see parents restricting access to the internet on their kids' cell phones. So it's obviously another issue. It's not that you think maybe that information is inappropriate for your child, or you would be taking a look at some other areas where your child has access to information. I think it's definitely more fear-based and just wanting to control what every other person in the community has access to. And it's also a way to send a message to marginalized voices that you're not acceptable and that you're not okay and you're not appropriate. So we're not going to offer programs for you. We're not going to put books on the shelf for you because you're not important and we don't agree with who you are.
Yeah, and to go off of that, Brookie, would you mind if you feel like you would be able to just sharing your experience with the book bans and how that has affected you and why this is such an important topic to you?
Sure. You know, working as a teen services librarian, it was my passion. I'm going to try not to get upset because it really did matter a lot to me. But I have 2 teenagers of my own, and I know what teens face and struggle with on a daily basis. And so being told to cancel those programs when I know that those teenagers don't have access to support services, sometimes at school, and sometimes they don't have it at home. Sometimes the last place that they're looking for that, they can find it in the library. And it's our job to serve all members of the community. So being told that I needed to cancel those programs, I just wasn't going to stand for it. I wasn't going to allow a library district that I worked for to silence my own children's voices. And I just didn't care if it cost me my job. It almost cost me my house because I was unemployed for 8 months. But at the end of the day, I felt like this is the right thing to do and I can lay my head down and sleep at night. It was shocking to me that I went to library administration and told them this is censorship. But there's more to it than just, in my case, library leadership trying to censor. We have a board that's behind that library district that there was a lot of problems with pushing their own agenda because it's more of a conservative community. So it just, you know, I knew I was going to get fired. When I started speaking out, I felt it. I knew it was coming. I was probably kind of surprised that it only took 4 weeks from beginning to end. And so once they fired me, they tried to offer me $5,000 in exchange for me to sign a contract that would waive all of my civil rights so that I could not sue them. And I took the contract and I left, and I sought legal representation, and Iris was my attorney, and I sued the library district. The Colorado Civil Rights Division had to do a year-long investigation. They determined that there was probable cause for discrimination. The Attorney General's office got behind my case and filed a complaint on my behalf. And we finally ended up coming to a settlement. And as part of that, they had to pay me $250,000. And they also, as part of the settlement agreement, were required to rewrite their program policy language to make it more inclusive. And they had to form a committee to start trying to review the programs that they were denying and anonymously survey librarians to get their feedback on whether programs were valuable for the community and make that information available to the librarians and available to the public if need be. So it wasn't just about the money for me, it was about trying to affect change in both policy and practice as well. So it's been a long journey. I finally landed at a great place that's very supportive of all of my efforts and really trying to keep a spotlight on this issue. So I'm happy where I'm at now, but it was a long process. It was very stressful. It was very lonely because a lot of people are afraid to speak up. I was very lucky to have the Intellectual Freedom Committee behind me and advocating for me, and local organizations like One Colorado. But I think I've somewhat started rebuilding my life. But it's still something that impacts my daily librarianship and will continue to, because it's important to me, and I'm not going to just allow somebody to cancel important programs for youth like that.
Thank you for sharing your experience. It's super powerful, and I'm sorry you had to experience that. That, like, I'm sitting here like trying not to cry because that hurts me too, and I'm like, ugh. So I guess my next question is we keep mentioning you all keep mentioning this idea of students can't get penalized or get in trouble for requesting information. How can we as students, especially the minority groups that are being affected by these book bans, how can we step up to protect our librarians and protect our education?
I think part of it goes back to an earlier question where we discussed going to school boards, and even community members, like-minded parents. Those are ways in which it's like we said earlier, getting non-librarian voices as the advocates for equal access to materials, programs, and all of that, and the necessity for that, and even sharing personal stories because stories are powerful. And so sharing a story of how something that happened in the library benefited you, or whomever, or a specific instance of a book that made a difference in your life, or any of that kind of thing. Those are areas that's what I first thought of as you asked that question.
Yes, definitely showing up to share your stories. That is a great thing to do. It could also be something as simple as checking out books by Black and Brown authors, checking out books written by LGBTQ authors. That's a great way to show your support for the library if you don't feel like you want to do it verbally or at a at a big school board meeting. Because libraries look at those statistics, right? And that's how we decide what books we want to buy for the upcoming years. So upping those circulation statistics, that is always really helpful. You can use like social media to advocate for your library and share your stories. That's a great way to do that too, from the comfort of your home. Knowing what's going on is also a really, like, becoming really news savvy and learning about what's happening in your library and in your school district and the decisions that are being made about your education. That's a great thing to do too, just becoming very aware of what's happening. And also, you can always submit, like Becky was saying, sharing really great stories about your library. You can like submit those anonymously too, if you don't feel like you want to tag your name on anything. But yeah, just telling your librarian that you're really grateful for their work. Telling the person who's in charge of your library that you're really grateful for the library's work. That's really powerful.
I mean, I think, Virgil, you guys are the ones who are going to know the most what to do if you brainstorm in your particular community. So there's a bunch of things. Like you said, you were having a banned book club at the beginning. I think you said that. I mean, that would be great. And it would be great if you promoted that and if you made those books available in ways that individuals who maybe can't access them can get access to them. I mean, it doesn't sound like there's necessarily a book ban in your county at the schools or the libraries. I could be wrong about that, but I mean, there's little free libraries. You can build little free libraries and say, banned book, little free library, come by, take your book, right? Bring it back. I love the idea of social media. It would be amazing if youth would connect not only kind of in their area, but across the state, right? I mean, we're seeing this with the environmental movement, gun control movement, right? People have built much larger organizations where they're giving each other resources and brainstorming ideas for how to support each other in different states. Like it's better in Colorado than it is in some other states, right? I know that like New York libraries, I think, I don't remember if it was Brooklyn or
Brooklyn. It's
it
Brooklyn.
was like they said, okay, if you're in a district or a county that you know, this book's been banned, download it for free from the Brooklyn Public Libraries and read it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of really interesting things working together, brainstorming ideas, making these books available, talking to parents about it, right? If it's something that's important to you. You have school newspapers that can be covering the topics, right? And like I said, there's also testimony, which can be scary, but I have not seen anything more powerful than youth getting up and sharing their stories and why this issue matters to them when you're in front of the Colorado State Legislature. And I promise those people are just normal people. They're normal people like us and anyone else. They just happen to be elected officials. And I think that it's 10 times more powerful than a bunch of lobbyists or a bunch of, you know, very reactionary, you know, school board members or community activists saying just hateful things, right, about historically marginalized and disenfranchised communities. It's much more powerful to have a bunch of you showing up about why they care about these things and how it's important to them, right? So there's just so many ways. And I think the biggest one is figuring out kind of what is the most exciting to you and your yeah, you know, your fellow students and how you want to figure out ways to support, because there's, and then to build that support and to continue with that support, because it's always hard to have a long battle, like Brookie was saying. And I know you guys will have some better ideas even than the ones that we are, you know, brainstorming here.
I think another one to look at, you mentioned the Brooklyn Public Library. They also have a Freedom to Read Teen Ambassadors program, which is a program where, and I'm reading this off my phone because I don't have it memorized, but it's a program where New York City teens can connect with peers to discuss book challenges, censorship, and intellectual freedom. So, you know, maybe starting something like that, either at your local, you know, public or school library, you know, where you're talking about those issues. Why is this being banned? And seeing how you can kind of come together to support each other and stand up for intellectual freedom.
Yeah, I wrote down the freedom to read and the book, right? I'm pretty excited to share that with the book club and the librarians over at Smoky. Again, and thank you so much for sharing all of your information. I really appreciate it, and hopefully this will be super beneficial. So, um, I guess for the sake of asking the question, is there a banned book that most people are like, hey, we shouldn't read this? Is there a book that you recommend that would spark a new like a new thinking or possibly a new movement, if you will, in schools?
Sure. I mean, I think the best thing to do is look at the top banned books, and they'll have the ones that are age appropriate, right? So the list can be found. I think the American Library Association is tracking that data. I think Pan America is tracking that data. You know, we kind of Googled the most banned children's books, most banned books, period. That information is pretty available. And much like you're doing now with your banned book club, you're gonna see, because they've been tracking this, the patterns of which books are getting banned the most. And it is unfortunately increasing because there's a couple activists, censorship activists out there that are training everyone else to target the same books over and over and over again in large amounts across the country. So that is honestly where I would start, because none of these censorship activists and the people who kind of harbor these biases or prejudices have even read the books. They just know that it's LGBTQ or, you know, youth of color, or, you know, kind of telling alternative histories or stories, or sharing different voices. And so, you know, it's hard because with reading, it's always very personal and immutable to the person, right? What's going to be moving or change the world. But I would start with that list, because you guys will find out what the most age appropriate, you know, books are that have been banned just because of the content and whose voices are featured in them or who the authors are. I think that'd be a great place to start, because they obviously have something important to say.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's any one book in particular, any of them. That was kind of the purpose of the Read Woke book club that I started at High Plains Library District. And I didn't create the program. That was actually created by Cicely Lewis, who is a school librarian in Georgia. But it's created kind of a book club that has been offered nationally and internationally at public libraries and school libraries as well. And we would actually just choose a book that focused on a different marginalized community every single month, and then get together, read that book, and then meet and discuss that book and talk about it. And I can't tell you how many times that I would have teens in there and we'd pick the book for the month and we're like, okay, here's what we're reading. Everybody would go home and read it. And when they came back, it was just really interesting to see how everybody would say, oh, I didn't think that I would have anything in common with that character and that I wouldn't be able to identify with that character. But after I read that book, I was like, well, that character was like me in so many ways. Like they felt insecure, or, you know, they had problems with anxiety, or whatever it may be. There was always something that they could find in that character to identify with. And like really by the end of the book felt like that could be my friend. You know, I would have things in common with that person, and it builds compassion and it builds empathy. And to see light bulbs turn on like that when students read those books and they don't think they have anything in common, maybe with a transgender character. And by the end of the book, they're going, wow, like I really like that character. And I think it, you know, builds that kind of compassion. So any kind of book I feel like is beneficial.
And that leads to why in policy, Virgil, what we call reconsideration policy, one of the components of that, if it's a strong policy, is that you have to read, the person complaining about the book has to read the entire book before they can lodge the complaint. You know, and if they, after they've read the whole book, want to go for it, because I think I misunderstood your question originally, but Yeah, it's really important because for the very reasons that Brookie just shared, you know, there can be a page where taken out of context, it looks like, whoa. And then when you read the whole work, it's so much more complex than that, just like life. So,
Yeah, and I'll also echo what everybody has been saying, that I don't think it's necessarily one book that's going to change everything, but reading a lot of books from people who have a lot of different life experiences than your own, like Brookie said, that's really, really important for developing empathy. There have been all kinds of studies that have shown that kids who read a lot turn into really empathetic adults. And of course, you know, as kind of things are feeling very like isolated post-COVID, we're all kind of like in our computers and kind of going internal. I think empathy is a really, really important skill that we need to nurture in students and in adults too. Everybody could do with a little good dose of empathy every now and then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and beyond empathy, it's also about making sure we don't repeat the same problems that we have historically, right?
Mhm.
You know, I want to boil all information or education to 1 or 2 points. The reason to read these books is important, you know, is reading a lot of other books too, that without sufficient knowledge and understanding of the complexities of our histories and how our society works and people's life experiences, we're kind of doomed to repeat some of the really terrible things that have happened in the past. And so, you know, in the interest of avoiding some of the horrific things that we've seen in our society or across the globe, it's really important to understand kind of everybody's, you know, perspectives on that and information that they give.
I think it's also really important for students that are feeling isolated to be able to read that book and see themselves in a character in a book and go, oh, I am okay as who I am. I am okay as the person that I am, and I'm not alone. And there are other people out there that are similar to me, and I can see that in books. And so it makes it less isolating for those young teens as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's not the book that I'm currently reading for school isn't necessarily a banned book, but it does cause you to think about things. It's called Beloved by Toni Morrison. And while it is a difficult read, um I do enjoy the fact that her writing is supposed to be uncomfortable. And as you said, Miranda, it creates this sense of empathy because it's a new perspective. And I really appreciate that you mentioned that empathy piece, that more of that needs to be a part of what's going on in these bands. Um, are there do I have more questions? I do. I have a lot of questions actually. I've got like 14. I don't think we can answer all of those in an hour, but
And Virgil, I did just want to pop in though. Toni Morrison is one of the most censored and banned authors across America. Her books show up on the top lists of those that are challenged and banned. One of the probably top 10 authors. So you have personal experience with maybe not in your school district, but with, you know, states and counties and you know, and politicians and school districts and library districts trying to ban the very books that you're reading, and you have first-hand experience about why they're so important to read.
and I think it's interesting that it's content based because and just it's content based off of who wrote it and what the experience is. Because while Toni Morrison's work is very blunt, very brutal about the topics she chooses to write about, The Road by Cormac McCarthy is violent. And the fact that a lot of kids at my school read that with no problem, but Beloved was an issue was interesting to me because I feel that it was not necessarily at the same level, but because who the author was, I feel like that has an impact. And I feel both books are necessary. But the censorship of one of them and that could have been a real experience is just a tad bit rude. and I'm being sarcastic, obviously. It's a not a wonderful thing. Oh, oh no. Um, well, thank you guys again for just being able to take time out of your day and explaining what is going on, what is the reality of these book bans, and how kids like me can benefit more from helping out librarians to prevent people from experiencing what you did, Brookie. And I'm very sorry that you again had to experience that, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Um, so
Mhm.
if you guys have any closing things you would like to say, go ahead now. But otherwise, we are wrapping up.
Well, I just want to say kudos to you for paying attention to these kind of issues. Not all young people are paying attention to these kind of issues, and so it kind of gives me hope. Um, and and yes, I think what I experienced was unfortunate, but I'd do it again in a heartbeat because it's the right thing to do. So I appreciate you keeping a focus on the issue as well.
Yeah. Virgil, I just want to echo what Berkey said and also say you guys are the future, not us. We'll be passing the baton off soon enough. And that's why we so appreciate you putting this amazing panel together and really love your perspective. And so we just want to thank you.
Yes, thanks so much, Virgil. It's always nice to talk to everybody about this. It's so nice to talk to younger people about these intellectual freedom issues too. It makes me so happy that that the students care about this and their education and their First Amendment rights and their freedom to read. My one last thought that I wanted to share, so there have been a ton of polls that have, asked a lot of different people about whether they support book bans, and almost nobody does. It's like 80% of people across all ages, political, like ideologies, everything, say that they don't support banning any material in schools or libraries. So just keep that thought in your head. Know that pretty much most people are on your side. It's only a very small, very vocal majority that's kind of causing all this trouble. So they shouldn't be too hard to take down if we also match their energy.
Thanks, Miranda, and thank you, Virgil. You give me hope. So, and thanks everyone. This is what a great way to end the day. Yeah, ending with hope is great. And Virgil, you're awesome.
Thank you guys again for just taking time out of your day and answering these questions, and for the guest appearances of your cats. I really appreciate that.